and wonderful introduction. I want, as the day wanes, as the Jaipur Literature Festival wanes, to acknowledge how extraordinary this event is, and my immense gratitude to William Dalrymple and to the other organizers and to the extraordinary staff, so attentive and gracious and hospitable. This is really a remarkable experience for me, so thank you. I am, as Tom said, going to talk about an obscure event about which I make an extravagant and almost certainly exaggerated claim. We know perfectly well that no single event actually changes the world decisively. It's always a concatenation of events, a succession of connections. But this very odd and neglected occurrence, something that happened in an obscure place, out of sight, no grand armies crossing plains or attacking forts, no assassinations, no significant world historical events. This one turned out to have an extraordinary, at least so I claim, an extraordinary rippling set of consequences. One day, nearly 600 years ago, a short, genial, rather pudgy, and very alert man who was in his late 30s took a book off a shelf, in effect, a manuscript that he found in a monastery, probably in southern Germany. He saw what he had in his hands, he recognized it for what it was, and he asked that the book be copied. And that was it. An extremely unnoticeable event, and yet it was enough. It was enough to set in motion a transformation of the world, which, in a way that whose consequences we are still living out. The reason he didn't say he would like to have the book is that the monks in southern Germany at that point didn't loan books to visiting Italian clerics. They knew that they wouldn't get the books back. But he decided that he would get it copied and sent it back to Italy. What he saw, this little man, what he saw was that he had in his hands a copy of a poem by a Roman poet named Lucretius, Titus Lucretius Carus, full name, a Roman poet whom he had read about, but whose work, a work called On the Nature of Things, no one in his world had seen or been able to read. They knew about it because this ancient poem, which was written in the year 50 BCE, around the time of Julius Caesar, this poem had been praised extravagantly by several other Romans, by the poet Ovid, had been mentioned in a significant way by Cicero. So they knew it existed, but they hadn't read it. And this man, Poggio Bracciolini, his name was, this Italian had read and absorbed as much as he could mentions of works that had not been seen for a very long time. So he was part of a community, and I'll come back to that a little bit, a community of people, of humanists, as they were sometimes called, book hunters, who went out, fanned out to monasteries in Europe, looking for manuscripts that would enable them to get back to the lost works of the ancient world. The book that he found on the nature of things had virtually disappeared. It had dropped out of circulation. It was not part of a conversation that had been going on. Unlike other works from the ancient world, some works from the ancient world, works by Plato and Aristotle particularly, had long ongoing conversations built around them. Some of the works were recovered via the Arabic world after the fall of Constantinople. Others had always continued in conversation, as it were, in the West, and were very important, had been picked up by, especially by Christianity, by the Catholic Church, above all Aristotle, but also in another tradition, works of Plato. But this work on the nature of things and everything it represented had fallen, as it were, into utter forgetfulness and forgetting and loss. It had been copied, however, a few times. Everything depended on copying, and this work had been somewhat miraculously copied at the crucial moment. Why copied? Because nothing lasts forever, as we know, especially works written on paper or even on parchment, which lasts longer than paper. These things have a limited shelf life, and then they disappear, even if it isn't a question of fire or flood or armies destroying and pillaging. They simply fall apart. They're eaten by insects or by vermin. They don't last. And Poggio, my hero of my book, The Swerve, Poggio was one of a group of people, as I say, who knew that there was a chance, at least, that certain books that they had not been able to read from the ancient world, but they knew of from descriptions by authors who had survived, certain of those works might still exist. They might still exist because they could have been copied even just once in the 8th or 9th century. That was probably the pivot point, for a reason I can explain to you, in which if a work was copied, it stood a chance of surviving. If it wasn't copied in the 8th or 9th centuries, it was almost certainly lost, even if there had been many copies before it, simply because, as I say, things fall apart. And Poggio, my hero, was probably the greatest of the Renaissance book hunters, the people in search of these lost books. It wasn't a profession you could live by. He couldn't make money at it, and he didn't imagine that he could. He came to Florence from a small town near Arezzo that's now been renamed after him. He came to Florence as a young man in the 1390s. He was penniless, he was friendless, and he managed to find his way into the attention of an important figure in the politics of Florence in the late 14th century, a man named Coluccio Salutati, who was himself a great scholar, as well as an important political figure. And through the help, first of all, this man Salutati helped to inspire Poggio and other young men with this desire to find out something from the ancient pagan past, the Roman past and the Greek past, the things that had been lost and could be recovered. And that, as it were, shaped his inward longings, but he couldn't live on that. What he really wanted to do, what he needed to do, was to get a letter of recommendation from Coluccio Salutati to the place where the real action was in the late 16th century. I teach at Harvard, and my students are always looking to see how they could get the desirable jobs at Google or at Facebook, and the equivalent at this point of where you might actually pluck the golden fruit was the Vatican in Rome. And Poggio got a letter of recommendation to the Vatican that enabled him to get a very lucrative position as one of the what they called apostolic secretaries in the Vatican. He was able to do so partly through, as I say, this letter of recommendation, but the reason he had the letter of recommendation is that he had very beautiful handwriting. So it's a kind of Gilbert and Sullivan story. where having fabulously beautiful handwriting, he had some of the most beautiful handwriting in the world has ever seen, enabled him to get a particularly lucrative job in the Vatican as a copier, a scriptor, a letter writer for the Pope. He had also, at this point, very, very good Latin. And he worked for a succession of popes, and he worked his way up in a highly competitive, in fact, often quite vicious environment in the Vatican until he became an exceedingly important person, which was the apostolic secretary, the principal secretary, to a man named Baldassare Cossa, who became the Pope named John the 23rd in the early years of the 15th century, and has the distinction of being probably the worst pope in the history of the papacy. There's a very long history of the papacy, and it's an incredibly impressive achievement to be the worst pope. So much so that he was, the Italians probably have a word for this, but I don't know, depopified. They took away, eventually, in a succession of extraordinary events at the Council of Constance, they kicked Baldassare Cossa, Pope John the 23rd, out of his position. They broke his seal, took away his position as Pope, and they arrested him. And as a consequence, his secretary was out of work. Our friend Poggio was out of work. So everything depends upon this strange succession of events in the early 15th century in which a brilliant young man on the way up in his 30s, who's achieved a tremendously lucrative position, finds that his boss has been arrested and finds himself without work. That turning out to be without work was a blessing, at least a blessing for the world, because he had time to go book hunting. And he had nothing else to do. And he found himself in a place in which he had access to monasteries that had not been pored over by other Italian book hunters. So he starts going out with a couple of others to look through the collections, the manuscripts that are in these monasteries. All right. Why is there a need for this book hunting? There's a need for the book hunting because some of you may have been to William Dalrymple's talk yesterday on his book, The Anarchy. And the situation that Dalrymple describes in 18th century Mughal India is rather like the situation that befell the Roman world in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, which could easily be called the anarchy, as William Dalrymple calls his book on India. Things fell apart. And when things fell apart in the Roman world, as a result of a succession of events that actually my interlocutor, Tom Holland, knows a great deal more about, I think, than I do and most people here. But when those events fell apart that led to the Roman Empire falling apart, one thing that happened was that schools closed. The schools were shuttered. Education basically came to a halt. And also the enterprise of copying stopped. The Roman world depended upon teams of copiers. This is, of course, long before mechanical reproduction of texts, long before the printing press. It depended upon teams of professional copiers in the Greek world and later in the Roman world. And that enterprise, the enterprise that is the predecessor of this whole Jaipur Literature Festival, the enterprise of copying, reproducing texts and distributing them, sending them out into the world, that came to an end. And with that coming to an end, there was a kind of massive loss, extinction, like kind of mass extinction that is, alas, happening in our world, in the biosphere, but happened in the intellectual sphere of the ancient world. So that, for example, Aeschylus, the great foundational Greek tragic playwright, wrote between 80 and 90 plays, of which 7 survived. Likewise, Sophocles, the author of Oedipus Rex, and other great works, he wrote 120 plays. 7 of them have survived. Oedipus Rex, which we regard as the greatest of the Greek tragedies, these were presented at competitions in Athens. Oedipus Rex came in second in that competition. The tragedy that came in first has been lost. There's massive loss of the works of the ancient world. And book hunters were set on fire when there became a renewed interest in the ancient past, for reasons we could talk about. In Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, book hunters went in search of some of those lost treasures. One thing that was hit particularly hard, most of the losses, as far as we can tell, were random. The result of the burning of libraries, the decay of materials, the floods and fires that beset any civilization that is fallen into disarray. But what is represented by the book that was a long poem that Poggio found in that extraordinary moment in the early 15th century, in 1417, he found that text of the lost poem on the nature of things. That represented something that was particularly hard hit in the ancient world. And that was the philosophy known as Epicureanism. Lucretius was a disciple of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And Epicurus wrote many, many works. Almost none of them survive. Epicurus' teacher, Democritus, wrote many works. None of them survive. The other great founder of Epicureanism, the other great hero for Epicurus, Leucippus, complete vanishing. The only truly substantial work of, some things have been recovered from the burned papyrus rolls in Pompeii and Herculaneum particularly, but only fragments of the lost work. It's this work by Lucretius, the disciple of Epicurus, that carries the full weight of Epicureanism. And the reason that Epicureanism was particularly hard hit was beyond the general historical decline, was that none of the great religions of the ancient world liked what he had to say. The polytheists of ancient Greece and Rome didn't like what Epicureanism stood for. The Jews didn't like what Epicureanism stood for. Actually, the Hebrew word for atheist still is apikoiros, just means Epicurean. The Christians hated what Epicureanism stood for. So the recovery of 7,400 lines of Epicurean verse, Lucretius' magnificent, long, long poem, which was a philosophical poem, was an extraordinary event. And the fact that it survived depended upon events that are difficult for us fully to recover. It simply means that a monk copied the long poem at a crucial moment. No one knows why in the 8th century. Maybe the monk himself didn't know why. The ancient works had a kind of, there was some interest in the monasteries in keeping some ancient works alive, but also there was a kind of discipline of copying. So monks who were in what they called scriptoria, in rooms where they were meant to copy things, were given as spiritual exercises, long things to copy, many of which they didn't actually fully engage with, except for the terrible act of having to sit there for hours and hours and copy these verses. And this text managed to survive. And in 1417, Poggio puts his hands on this poem. And the poem returns to a circulation. Well, why is that so important? It's important for reasons that actually Tom's book, Dominion, would suggest, which is that Christianity at this point, 1417, was the overwhelming vision of the world for virtually everyone in Western Europe. And that vision was a vision that was at utter odds with the vision of Epicureanism. Why? Epicureanism, Lucretian Epicureanism, believes that the world is made up of atoms, the Greeks called them. Lucretius calls them the seeds of things, seminararum, the atoms and emptiness and nothing else. Atoms and emptiness and nothing else. That was bad enough for the world of the 15th century, the Christian world of the 15th century, but it gets much worse. Lucretius writes in De Rerum Natura that the world has no creator, no designer. The particles themselves, the atoms, have not been made and cannot be destroyed. Nature functions without divine control and without a designer. Secondly, nature ceaselessly and randomly experiments. In the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, it's very clear that all the species on the earth are created by God in the first days. But Lucretius and Epicureans argued that no, things exist because of mutations. Mutations in the atomic structures of things. Over an enormous amount of time, strange things happen. New creatures are born. And if those new creatures or new features of creatures help those creatures survive, and survival means to get enough food to eat and to reproduce, then it's possible that that species will thrive and will last for a while. This notion of mutations leading to the emergence of species that survive if they're fit did not actually become fully part of the consciousness of the Western world, even though it's in Lucretius, was not fully, how shall we say, absorbed in the West until Charles Darwin in the 19th century. Third, Lucretius argued that the world was not made for humans. It's not about humans. This is not the story of us. We're not the most important or the only things in the world. There was no original state of paradise in which humans lived in a world specially made for them. The world isn't made for humans. If humans survive, they survive the way other creatures do. We make our way in an environment that's often intensely hostile, and we're vulnerable. We're thrown into the world, Lucretius says, like an infant, like a shipwreck. An infant is like a shipwrecked person, he says, thrown onto the shore. And early humans, he thought, were speechless, were primitive, and only slowly developed the skills that have enabled them to construct civilizations. The fate of an entire species, such as that of the humans, let alone that of any one of us, any individual, that's not the pole around which everything revolves in the universe. And in fact, Lucretius suggests there's no reason to believe that our species will last forever. There's no reason to think that humans are. Not only are we not the only game in town, but we're not going to make it to the end of anything. There'll be other creatures. Then we're not unique. We're entirely part of the natural world, Lucretius argued. We're made of the same stuff that everything else is made of. We're made of the same atoms in a different configuration that make up the floor, that make up the cloth above our head, that make up the stars, that make up dirt. We're not made of special stuff. And that, if we want to understand ourselves, our lives can only be understood in the same terms with which we understand any creature that forages for food, any creature that experiences the drive to reproduce its kind. And then this gets worse and worse. Then he argues we have a soul. The soul is made up out of atoms, very fine atoms, the way the body is made up out of atoms, and the soul dies the way the body dies. The human soul has no afterlife. There's no posthumous punishments and rewards in heaven or hell. Life on earth, Lucretius writes, is all that human beings have. When our bodies die, our souls die as well, and those souls cannot be reconstituted. And as a result of this argument, which is an argument from physics, effectively, ancient physics, he goes on to argue that all religions are superstitious delusions. You can see why the Christians and the Jews, but also the ancient polytheists, were not fond of this philosophical theory. He thought that humans project their desires and fears onto imaginary creatures, and they get trapped into false beliefs. There are entirely natural explanations for the things that frighten human beings, like lightning and thunder, or earthquakes, and Lucretius spelled out what he thought the natural explanations were, but terrified humans instinctively respond with religious fear and start to pray. Praying, he said, is futile. And the horrors that are imagined to afflict us in the afterlife are actually representations of what humans actually do in this world to each other. Because Lucretius thought that religions are part of a particularly disagreeable side of humanity, which is cruelty. They always promise love and hope, but their deep underlying structure, the deep underlying structure of religions, he thought, is based on anxiety and retribution and sacrifice. And as I say, this comes into the world in the 15th century, into a culture that has absolutely central to it a vision of sacrifice, the vision of Jesus crucified on the cross, the ultimate sacrifice. For Lucretius, who's writing 50 years before Christ is born, for Lucretius, sacrifice, especially human sacrifice, is the ultimate cruelty that religions tend to circle back upon. What's the alternative? The alternative, he argued, is that the goal of life should be the enhancement of pleasure and the reduction of pain. The enhancement of pleasure and the reduction of pain not only for humans, but for as many creatures as possible. Life should be organized to serve the pursuit of happiness. And there's no, he said, no higher ethical purpose in life than to facilitate this pursuit of happiness for oneself and for one's fellow creatures. All the other claims, and you remember he's writing at the time of Julius Caesar, the claim to serve the state, the claim to glorify the gods or the rulers, the arduous pursuit of virtue through self-sacrifice, all those arguments are misguided or fraudulent. Militarism and competitive sports, violent sports, for example, that characterized Roman culture. This is the culture of the Colosseum. This seemed to Lucretius, in the deepest sense, perverse and unnatural. He's a deeply countercultural writer, poet in his own time in relation to the pagan Roman world. He said that man's natural needs are simple. A failure to recognize these boundaries of needs leads human beings to a fruitless search for something that lies beyond their capacity to experience. Just experience pleasure while you're alive and help other human beings experience pleasure as well. That's what he and his master, Epicurus, argued. Okay, this comes back in 1417. Boom! Into the world. Full-fledged in this magnificent poem written in extraordinarily beautiful Latin hexameters, which people like Poggio Bracciolini had spent their lives mastering aesthetically, so they could see immediately that the work was extraordinarily beautiful. It's beautiful, but it's unbearable. Unbearable because it seems to violate everything we good Christians of the 15th century believe is absolutely true. It's an insult to everything that we believe. And indeed, even to this date, of course, it's it carries a highly controversial message in the world. And so my book is really about what happened when this work, this uncanny return of the lost ancient philosophy of materialism, what happened when it came back into the world? And what happened, I won't take the time now to try to tease it out, but what happened is a very complex process of aversion and attraction. Because in some sense, many of the things that Lucretius was saying, however outrageous they were, also corresponded to something that many people had felt inside, but actually couldn't fully articulate for themselves. It was too dangerous to articulate. It seemed to violate common sense, the common sense of the 15th century, the common sense, for that matter, for many of us now, and yet it seemed to resonate for them. It seemed to speak to them, but it was too dangerous to speak for yourself. And what happened, one of the many things that fascinates me about this whole remarkable history is that, in effect, there are several hundred years in which the work, this remarkable, very long poem circulates, but it circulates in a world that cannot bear what it's saying, and yet it keeps reading and circulating. Now, why? Well, why? First of all, because for reasons that are interesting, because it's a very beautiful poem. It was picked up in schools because it is an extremely good poem if you want to learn very good Latin. So school teachers in the 15th century began to teach their students this poem to get a sense of what really beautiful Latin poetry sounds like. And so in the beginning of printing, when the printing press comes along at the end of the 15th century, there are early printed editions of Lucretius, and the work begins to circulate in larger numbers as a school text. And at a certain point in the early 16th century, finally, in Florence, the people who run the schools in Florence said, "Are we crazy? We're giving children this text to read," and they wanted the books burned. But it was too late. The books were already in circulation. So that's one of the things that happens. And there are a succession of, as they say, complex approach avoidance responses to Lucretius, but it's too dangerous ever to say these ideas are one's own. And that was discovered to his cost massively, 200 years almost after Poggio Bracciolini found and recirculated the text. A Italian ex-Dominican monk, a philosopher, a very revolutionary philosopher named Giordano Bruno, basically embraced these theories of atomic materialism and the pursuit of pleasure as his own. He articulated them as his own principles. He was arrested. He was interrogated for years. He was tortured by the Inquisition. And finally, he was taken out in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome and burned at the stake. As he was being taken out, before they nailed his tongue, so he couldn't speak, but before they nailed his tongue to his mouth, he said, he was obviously terrified, as with good reason, but he said, you who are doing this are more afraid than I am. You're more afraid. And in the long term, that turned out to be true, because the ideas that began to circulate with increasing rapidity, that you begin to get glimpses of from the 17th century on, in Bruno, in Galileo, subsequently in Isaac Newton, and then in a massive flood, in effect, in Einstein, in Darwin, in Karl Marx, all actually can be traced back to what Lucretius, to what Poggio Bracciolini brought back into the world. I think that I should stop here, and I'm going to sit down, and Tom and I can have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that tour de force. I'll just ask a couple of questions and then we'll open up to the floor. I wonder if we could just look at the subtitle, How the World Became Modern, and look at the issue of modernity in the context of the land we're sitting in now, India, which, of course, there have been many punctuation marks in Indian history, the coming of Islam, the coming of the British, which has radically served to recalibrate culture in India. But nevertheless, what you have in India that you don't have in Europe is a sense of a kind of continuity lasting centuries, millennia. And philosophical texts, holy texts have been written down, and before that have been learnt and recited all the way back to the Rig Veda. How important do you think it is that in Europe, in contrast to India, you do have this sense of an absolute rupture, that the Roman Empire collapses, and then there is a kind of universal feeling in Europe that what has been lost, can it be reborn? And therefore, perhaps in the idea of going back to the past, you then open up the idea of going to actually a radically uncertain future. And that is something that really distinguishes the way that Europe sees itself to the way that India sees itself.
That's a fascinating question. There are many people here in the audience who are probably far better suited to answer it than I. I would say that we could start with the fact that Epicureanism emerged from a polytheistic world, not a monotheistic world. So Epicureanism, even though it was not liked it was held in some suspicion and anxiety by the priests of various Roman and before that Greek gods, nonetheless it was able to develop and thrive in that world. If there is a world with multiple gods, multiple religions, it's possible for Epicureanism and everything it represents to exist uncomfortably, but in a kind of negotiation with religious life. But what happened in the Christian West is that the triumph of Christianity put in place a vision of a single monotheistic deity who centered on the cult of sacrifice, that made and with a vision of an orthodox vision of the afterlife, of punishments and rewards in the afterlife, that was insisted upon virtually universally. That the Catholic here means universal. Everyone must believe this, and if you don't believe this, heads you win, tails I burn you at the stake. You can't survive not adhering to this idea. That becomes incompatible with this Epicurean alternative. So that when it comes back as something that had been repressed, hidden, dismantled, and that therefore comes back as a shock. Whereas I think actually it's probably more negotiable in a world that has one thing that strikes an ignorant visitor to India, such as myself, is the different relationship to materiality in the religious world in India, to a different relation to the animal world, a different relation to the flesh and materiality, a different relation to a bodily process that represents I think, a significant alternative to the way in which the Jewish and then subsequently Christian world developed its theology. So, as I say, I can't speak to how these ideas. I'm fascinated in general by the way in which all of us deal now in the West as well, because we've had now 400 or 500 years to try to come to terms with what came back in Lucretius. But when you drive here to the Jaipur Literature Festival down the street, you see the hospitals, people giving MRIs and CAT scans, things that depend upon nuclear medicine, whose underlying vision is finally a Lucretian vision, but it's incompatible with, as we think of it, with most religions. But it's obviously not incompatible. We all are able to make some kind of negotiation with it. But I think it's probably easier in India than it was in the West. And after all, Darwin, even now in my country, many of my, even though I think no one in the scientific world doubts the fundamental principles of Darwinian evolution, many of my fellow countrymen absolutely refuse to believe it because it's incompatible with a strict Christian interpretation, a fundamentalist Christian interpretation of the origins of the world.
But I suppose it's also because if you assume that you as an individual have been created in the image of an all-powerful God, then that gives you a kind of dignity, it gives your life a sense of purpose, that if that is important to you, reading a philosopher who tells you that life is all we have and you're just a collection of atoms, that could seem desolating. And I wonder the response to the discovery of Epicurus in the Renaissance. What was the balance between those who found his poetry liberating, intoxicating, exciting, and those who were not just appalled by it, but terrified by it?
I mean, the fascinating thing about that moment, those not just moment, but the first centuries of the attempt to absorb what this was saying, was that the people who responded most with most sympathetic excitement were not responding to the basic philosophical principles, but were responding to the beauty of the poetry. And that's important because Lucretius himself says that the reason he's writing this in poetry is, he says, to smear some honey around the lip of the cup. So when you drink this drink, it won't taste bitter. And the poetry is the honey. And it turns out that that is true in relation to the reception of Lucretius. The people who really responded to Lucretius were the artists of the 15th and 16th century. Was the great Florentine artist Piero di Cosimo, the even greater or the better known Florentine artist Botticelli. The Primavera is basically a Lucretian allegory. The poets of the 15th and 16th century, they're the people who immediately respond. And in fact, even as far afield as England, which is after all sort of remote from this story, you get Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet mentioning atoms, talking about little atoms in Mercutio's speech. And you get glimpses of the fact that these ideas are beginning to circulate quietly. There's an extraordinary, very late, the work wasn't translated into English until very late. Everything comes to England in this period rather late. But there's a remarkable 17th century translation by a woman, Lucy Hutchinson, who said that she wanted to understand, she translated the poem, and it's no mean feat to translate the poem. It's a significant effort. She wanted to translate the poem because she wanted to know what the men were talking about so quietly in the other room. So this is a poem you talk about very quietly, because it's dangerous otherwise.
And you... Epicurus emphasizes that the purpose of life essentially is pleasure. And there is a sense in which, of course, that can be misinterpreted, and indeed is misinterpreted in antiquity, and then when it gets rediscovered in the Renaissance, that Epicurus is basically saying, you know, party, get drunk, have a fantastic time, take drugs, whatever you want. And I suppose in that there's a slight parallel to Machiavelli, that Machiavelli becomes influential in the Renaissance and the early modern period at least in part for what he doesn't say, as well as what he does say? And is there a sense in which the Epicurus who gets rediscovered in the Renaissance is a mythic figure, a garbled figure, a product of Chinese whispers, rather than the actual philosopher that Lucretius is writing about?
Absolutely. Epicurus, there are ancient accounts of Epicurus' own life, and it's very clear that Epicurus led what we would regard as an ascetic life. Epicurus is someone much more familiar in some sense in the Indian tradition of someone who, what we would think of as denying the body. He contented himself with very, very little to eat. He led a very simple life. He did certain things that were very strange from the ancient world. For example, he admitted women into his school, which was not done typically by the Platonists or the Aristotelians, but he didn't think that there was a significant difference between the intelligence of women and men, and he absorbed women into his community, but it was not for sexual intercourse. In fact, though he urged people, Lucretius more explicitly, urges people to have a lot of sex. He thought sex was good. He didn't think that you should, he thought you should have a lot of sex in order not to be so focused only on sex. He thought if you denied yourself sexual activity, you'd think about it all the time. And it would be better to just to have, go ahead and have some, but not to have it at the center of your life, not to have food at the center of your life, not because these things take over, he thought. They interfere with what it is to have a kind of calm in your existence, a feeling of being at peace in the world. And what he really wanted was to feel that feeling of peace, not to feel vulnerable. It's a strange vision, actually. However attractive in certain ways, one of the most famous passages in Lucretius is a passage in which he describes being up on the top of a high cliff and looking down at a ship at sea that is being destroyed in a storm. And you can't do anything about it. You're on a cliff, high above, you can't save anyone in that ship from the shipwreck, and you have to learn to be calm, to have a kind of philosophical calm when you see the catastrophes all around you. The world is full of catastrophes, and you have to learn how to achieve a certain philosophical distance from the torments, which is itself, he thought, part of the deep pleasure that you are seeking in life. The pleasure is not the pleasure of the belly. The pleasure is not the pleasure of the genitals. You should have those, but they shouldn't take over.
Thank you. I remember I remember an essay I read a while ago that compared the relationship of Romans to Epicurus to that of the Beatles and the Mahesh Yogi. But be that as it may, do we have any questions? I'm going to leave it to in the front, and then gentlemen there.
Thank you so much, Professor Greenblatt. Now, your work refers to both history and the practice of philosophical poetry. Now, historically, this whole practice of reading, for example, one notable omission is Spinoza. Spinoza's revolution of the modern philosophy. But in terms of poetic practice, I would like to draw your attention to George Santayana, who writes about philosophical poetry. And it is in that context. Now, you refer to future and your concluding reference to happiness. Now, the Dalai Lama is also talking about happiness. So my point is that in Lucretius, in being with the ancient, what are the seeds for the ancient, present, and the future? In India, we have a long tradition of spiritual materialism. In a way, contemporary science is coming to that. So my query is that the whole practice of philosophical poetry, what would be a kind of a future poetry that Sri Aurobindo from India has talked about, yes, which can dialogue with people like Lucretius?
Thank you. First of all, it is absolutely the case that George Santayana is a crucial figure in the modern reception of Lucretius. Santayana wrote brilliantly about Lucretius. It is also the case that in the ancient world, Lucretius' great philosophical master, Epicurus, was not a poet. He was much more like Spinoza. He actually was skeptical about poetry. One of the few quotations, one of the few ideas that survives from Lucretius is the phrase, "I spit on poetry." But Lucretius, his great follower, is a poet. And as I said, he's a poet because he thought that this was a way of passing these thoughts on to the world without the world rejecting them, feeling that they're too bitter. I think that beyond that strategic goal, what your question points to is something that is very important to me as a literary scholar, which is the belief that the division between art, on the one hand, art, poetry, painting, literature, and thought, philosophical thought, is including scientific thought, that this is a disaster, that the division of the two cultures has not served us well, that we're living now in a terrifying moment in which our technology has far exceeded our ethical thinking, and in which we need to recover the connection between our philosophical and aesthetic thought and our scientific and technological understanding. And I think we can see in Lucretius's philosophical poem a kind of guide, a thread that will lead us to think of your implications of your question into a future that would be less terrifying than the one that we seem to be heading toward.
Thank you very much for your deliberations. Myself is Umesh Prasad Singh. I'm a man of English literature. My question to you is very direct for the sake of clarification. I need your intervention with respect to counter-cultural pagan Roman world which you mentioned during the course of your speech. And I'm also reminded of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is a question. Because I'm a man of literature and I love to read and write on Shakespearean literary criticism. So on this account, I want to know from you with respect to counter-cultural pagan Roman world which you mentioned with respect to Renaissance during the course of your lecture.
Thank you. Let me say that actually, as I hope I've indicated, I'm very drawn to Epicureanism, to Lucretius, and particularly to the philosophical vision of Lucretius, and the poetic vision of Lucretius. I find one thing disturbing in Lucretius, and I've not been able to reconcile myself to it, a sense that there's no reason to think that life is better than not being alive. That is to say, it's very unclear to me how a serious Epicurean, a serious Lucretian, would think that it makes a difference whether you're alive or not existing in the world. Of course, if you're alive, you can pursue pleasure, but that's not an adequate explanation for why you would choose life. So I think precisely to be or not to be, which is at the very center of the, as you say, of Shakespeare's vision in Hamlet, is a question that actually a Lucretian couldn't answer very well. And I find that quite unnerving. And it's one of the reasons that I'm not, how should we say, I'm only 9/10 an adherent of this idea.
Okay, thank you. Probably got time for one more question. Let's yes, the lady there.
Thank you. I quickly want to address a very interesting thought that came to me. I'm currently a student of Krishna consciousness. And when we think of the idea of pleasure and human existence, Krishna embodied that. I don't know if you're aware of the Krishna philosophy, but he said you have 4 basic goals in human life. And ultimately, the karmic law holds you responsible for where you take your human existence. So the difference between the Western idea of Epicureanism is that you just exist for pleasure, is taken to a level where Krishna says, yes, you are here for pleasure, but you're also responsible because I've given you human life. Human life comes to you after 85,000 lives as other species and other animals. And it's a very fascinating thought that you are so empowered that it's not even God that can take you to a happy place, it's your actions. The more you give pleasure to others, the more you empower others, the more you serve God through your actions. That is evolution, and that is where you're meant to go. And eventually the goal is to lead a higher existence in another realm. So imagine that's where the human Indian philosophy would actually take you.
You have a minute.
Thank you. Let me just say that there is some, I think, plausible speculation that Epicureanism, and in its full flowering, its form in Lucretius, was influenced by Indian philosophy. There's no hard evidence for this, but what you have just said so eloquently suggests that one of the things that may be, in fact, so continuing appealing and attractive about the recovery of this remarkable poem is that it puts us back to a moment at which the world of your spiritual and material speculation and the world of the ancient Epicureans was actually intertwined. And that connection was broken, ruptured, and we can recover now the possibility of a dialogue between what I think otherwise becomes increasingly sterile Western scientific materialism with what you describe. So I welcome exactly the challenge that you pose.
That is a perfect note on which to end a talk about a Roman poet discovered in a German monastery held in Rajasthan. So please join me in thanking Stephen Greenblatt for a tour de force.
Thank you, Tom.
And he will be signing his books in the tent. Thank you very much, everyone.
Huge thank you to Tom Holland and Stephen Greenblatt for a session full of enlightenment, no pun intended. As Tom mentioned, Professor Greenblatt will be signing books at the Z Kiosk. You can purchase his book, The Swerve, at the JCB Prize for Literature bookstore managed by Full Circle, and make your way back here to the Z Kiosk, which is just at the rear of the Nexa front lawn. We will be back here in close to 15 minutes for our next session.